All right, welcome back, everyone. Let's get this party started. So, I hope you've enjoyed the snow. This is usually the time of year I like to go around campus and pelt students with snowballs, just the bad ones. No. So, actually, it is nice to see some snow. We've had a snow drought in parts of the country. So it is good to see some replenishment of our waterways. And here in Pennsylvania, we've got some of the most polluted waterways in the country. Now, Pennsylvania also has some of the most waterways in the country, so that plays a role. But one thing I've come to learn in moving to Pennsylvania from California, from Santa Barbara, California, which has a lot of environmental regulations and stuff like that. Looking at where counties lie in Pennsylvania, a lot of counties in Pennsylvania are in the top 10% dirtiest amongst a whole range of different chemicals, toxic releases, and so on. Anyway, so you can kind of look at that. It's kind of interesting, what's going on in Pennsylvania. Well, a lot, and we'll talk about that. So I did want to just briefly kind of run through these theories again. You can think of, two ways of, addressing the environment or sort of looking at it, interpreting it. One is this treadmill of production. This is kind of like the accelerationist philosophy, which is this a broad range of ideas that we'll talk about when we talk about science and technology. But basically, these broad ideas that, systems are moving quicker and, there's nothing we can really do about them. So they argue that you should just kind of accelerate the speed of the treadmill, essentially. Hold on, I've got a cat I've got to save. All right, I'm back. Okay, sorry, trying to babysit some cats here. Okay, so the treadmill of production, again, as I was saying, we'll kind of talk about some of these philosophies about society and processes when we talk about science and technology. So the treadmill of production, a more pessimistic view of our relationship with the environment. Ecological modernization pretty much kind of encompasses a lot of the industrial world's approach to the environmental concerns, everything from energy to waste and so on. As I said, what you find in a lot of places then is this mix of markets and of government regulation. And so a lot of the research I did for my dissertation and book looked at was kind of looking at ecological modernization in terms of the building industry and developing, developing structures using what they call sustainable construction, where you're using better materials, stuff that's going to last longer, and that sort of thing. And so in some ways it was ecological modernization of real estate and development, something that people hadn't really looked at before, and so I decided to do that. So one thing, I've seen a number of discussions about this or along these lines already in Packback. Feel free to go into it in even more depth if you want. Which perspective do you agree with more in terms of maybe viewing the environment or providing us with a good path forward, that sort of thing? I'll let you determine that. I'm going to go through a few kind of specific things that sometimes we forget. And as I said, so often we think of the environment as, some sort of wilderness. And historically, the environmental movement has been focused on these, sort of pristine areas. But now we know that there really aren't any pristine areas left. We're one planet, one big ecosystem. Last time I went over some of the bird populations and we looked at, how they have been falling quite dramatically in the United States and in Europe, for example. Well, there have been some bird populations that have exploded, huge jumps in the population, exponential growth and everything. They just happen to not really be wild birds. So we have an enormous animal industry. I reviewed some books for Oxford's environmental sociology textbook. I'm sorry. I reviewed some chapters for Oxford's environmental sociology textbook, and there was one chapter on the growth of the meat industry in North Carolina, and just how the hog industry just kind of exploded over the last 20, 30 years. And this sort of came up again just a couple months later when there was a lot of flooding in North Carolina a couple of years ago, and a lot of farms were flooded, and that water was very, very toxic. So, a good movie, if you're interested, is the movie Okja, looking at the meat industry, and it's looking at these sort of super pigs. This girl has this pet super pig these pigs are wanted because they are super and everything. Other thing, Bong Joon-ho, the director, was a sociology major, in addition to winning an Oscar for Parasite. Okay, so I think these numbers are kind of stunning. 50 million penguins in the world, 20 billion chickens in the world. 1980, you had 2 billion wild birds in Europe, about 1.6 billion today. In the meantime, they've raised almost 2 billion chickens. 90% of large animals on Earth are either humans or domesticated animals. There are not very many elephants, rhinoceri left in the world, and so and their populations are changing. In some places, excuse me, where they have some strong environmental measures, we see that their populations are doing much better. The big challenge when we talk about the environment is recognizing that the old debate of the 20th century, which was economy or the environment, most people, thoughtful people, recognize now that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. That the economics and economic theories of the 19th and 20th centuries really kind of were built on this idea that, resources are just there. They're kind of like bolted in, and then, you develop the theory out of that. Not really thinking about the ideas of scarcity or changes in climate or just, huge biosphere changes that we are only now starting to recognize. But the challenge will be then, taking that knowledge of our interconnectedness and ecosystems and everything, and then developing an economy that sort of works. And equity is going to be a huge part of it. Equity does not mean, pure equality or so on, but greater sort of, fairness. As we'll see, different groups are differently affected in pretty radical ways. Hold on. All right. I'm back again. Okay, so as I was saying, I believe there's a focus on equity, and as we'll talk about that, as we'll discuss, different groups are affected quite differently. Now, we also have to think about the fact that, some of these resources that are extremely detrimental and damaging to the environment and to human health are also what have literally fueled our way of life, the Industrial Revolution, and so on. So coal is really kind of, was literally kind of the fuel of the Industrial Revolution, and then oil came along. So a few things, there are a lot of misconceptions about the coal industry in the United States, for example. So the United States is actually generating less of its electricity through coal than it used to, and it's been a huge change. And that really I should say, 6 coal-fired plants have closed since the presidential election. The presidential election that's actually from last time, 2016. You actually saw more coal-fired plants shut down over the last few years than you have, in several years. Why is that? Well, it's not actually because of environmental regulation. That has had some effect on coal in the United States, but far less of effect than natural gas. natural gas has been since about 2003 to 2005, the United States has been investing heavily in the extraction of natural gas. And you've seen many power plants switching from coal to, to natural gas. Now, a couple things about this. Oh, another thing about the coal industry. So natural gas, that's its biggest competitor. You also have solar on the rise, just still not quite as competitive, but it's there, and it's making inroads quite quickly into the energy market. The other thing is efficiency gains. So, technology, as we'll talk about next week, just tremendous advances in technology. So that you don't need as many people to work in the coal industry because now you have machines that can do a lot of these things, So that's really what's hitting the coal industry, and West Virginia, parts of Pennsylvania, and so on, that have relied on coal, are going to be hit pretty hard. And I don't think there's going to be any way around that. There used to be a professor here who taught social problems who, strongly is faithful in the idea of clean coal. I'm skeptical, although it's amazing what humans have done. So we'll kind of see what happens with that. So I do want to clear up some misconceptions there. Other things about natural gas. So natural gas is not perfect. Some of you may be pretty familiar with natural gas because of all the drilling here in Pennsylvania. I started doing some research on this with a student, and we kind of looked at a few companies. That's really kind of fascinating what happened. I mean, Pennsylvania basically opened up, the state to be drilled, and all these companies came in. And a lot of them are drilling for natural gas, but they're also drilling for oil. They can kind of do both at the same time. And so you can see there the red is for the Marcellus Shale, this huge expanse of rock where you can get natural gas from. That goes over, under most of Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, and other places. Fracking is not allowed in New York. So, if you look at this map with, fracking locations in New York, right there, you see nothing there. So fracking, though, has been huge in Pennsylvania. And, that's, it's been a topic of the presidential election. A couple of things about natural gas. So natural gas is, in some ways, is worse than coal in the sense that it is dirtier and has, is a worse greenhouse gas, but it dissipates sooner. So it's not in the atmosphere as long. So in that sense, it's not as damaging. And so actually, since the United States started turning toward natural gas, there was a dip in the amount of greenhouse gas emissions in total that we were using. I think from roughly around 2011 through 2017 or so. As the economy started going again, you started to see more emissions just because of more economic activity. Now, again, as I said, some people have talked about natural gas as sort of like a transitionary fuel from coal to solar or something like that. We'll kind of see where some of these things end up going. When we look at basically where the greenhouse gas emissions are coming from, a lot of it's coming from electricity. So, if we can reduce or change our source of electricity, that will dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Transportation, and some of these have fallen already. We just don't have all the data in yet, but people who have been studying some of the data as what's been available have found that coronavirus led to a huge drop in greenhouse gas emissions, especially during the first few months of the lockdown. There's also many many videos of animals walking through sort of, empty town squares. And, I think there's this like battle between these two monkey gangs. And I believe it was Thailand, one from some monastery, one that were usually getting fed by, by tourists. And so with the tourists not being there, the monkeys didn't have food. And so you had this gang of monkeys get into a fight. There were a lot of also, photoshopped images and sort of misinformation about animals coming out and stuff. But yeah, it's what we call succession, ecological succession. Basically, it doesn't take too long for nature to come back, so to speak, or at least, if not come back, retake over abandoned places. So this, I think I meant actually for this slide to be, well, anyway. So the United States, I talked about the coal in the United States. But when we look globally now, the two big countries that we need that, are going to be, extremely important in terms of the state of the environment are India and China. Obviously, they have the most people, huge economies, that sort of thing. So, around 60% of India's power is coming from coal. So they, that's a big change that, they're going to have to make. Coal power is, the percentage that's coming from coal is coming down. At the same time, you have the biggest coal company in India, and I forget how much coal they still think is is under the ground in India, but it's a huge amount. And I think I've heard scientists say that, there's no way we can, burn up all that coal, or else it's all gonna, just totally overwhelm the atmosphere, that sort of thing. So, which brings us to the topic of the day in terms of environmental sociology, global warming, climate rising, all these things. And we've seen year after year, just week after week, more and more dramatic examples of climate change occurring. First of all, how can we measure climate change, or how do we know, where does this come from? How do we compare it to the past? One of the ways in which we do this is by examining ice cores. So we can drill deep into the ice in, say, Antarctica, and look at the frozen ice that's been frozen since, the last few thousand, 10,000, 100,000 years and so on. And we can, based upon the composition of the ice cores, the bubbles, the oxygen, and so on, we can determine the type of chemicals that were in the atmosphere, and so on. In terms of, looking at the atmosphere, global warming, and, our energy use, we're pretty good in terms of knowing how much energy we've used, roughly. Governments, companies have kept data for the last couple hundred years that we've been using, fossil fuels and so on. And for the most part, we have a pretty good idea of how much we use, and it corresponds roughly to what we would expect to see in if not the atmosphere, in the Earth. So something happened back shortly after I was in college, as I was going into graduate school. It was sometimes called the climate pause. There were a few years where it seemed that global warming was not increasing, or was not increasing rapidly, and they were looking at the atmospheric temperatures, and there was this kind of idea that, well, maybe it's not happening, or maybe it's not as big of a problem as we think it is. But scientists were still sort of befuddled, because we know that X amount of greenhouse gas emissions have been put into the atmosphere. We know through chemistry, the atmospheric chemistry, that is going to change the composition of the atmosphere. But it wasn't causing the warming that people expected. Well, then some scientists started looking at the temperature of the oceans and started doing big studies there. And then you saw during the last 10 years a number of studies look at the oceans and the temperature, looking at atmospheric temperatures and so on. Some of this being done right here at Penn State. And they found that the vast majority of the warming is actually happening in the ocean. So this is why the glaciers in in the Arctic and Antarctica and Greenland are melting much more rapidly than scientists had expected or predicted about 10 years ago. I think what's very alarming for me, 2004, 2005 is roughly when I started becoming, very interested in global warming from a sociological and scholarly perspective. And as I said, what was rather alarming was that there were projections for the oceans warming and all these things happening, off into the 2040s and so on. But by already 2015, we were already seeing some of those things that in 2005 had been predicted for the 2040s were already happening. And with the oceans warming, that really, I think woke up a lot of scientists to what was going on, and now we have a much better understanding of why the glaciers are melting, and what that means. And it's now scientists are rapidly trying to do a bunch of studies on these glaciers. So, what do we do about this? Well, there are different ideas. I want to sort of introduce kind of an ecological modernization perspective. We're going to watch a video. This video is a bit longer than ones I usually show, about 19 minutes long, but I think it's good. It was made a few years ago, and I'll post a little 5-minute video, whatever. Kept on going down. I think it's 7 minutes. A little video that, is a bit more recent, I think, on this idea of de-extinction. So Stuart Brand is famous for, back in 1968, writing this book called The Whole Earth Catalog. It's not really a book, I should say. It's kind of like it's like a catalog. It's got a lot of pictures in it. It's kind of like how you want to live on your own. If you need to, make a hut and grow some food and, build a clothesline or, all these different things. Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple Computers, said, it was kind of like our internet back in the 60s and 70s. Stuart Brand was a scientist who has become very controversial because he advocates nuclear power, geoengineering, which not Stuart Brand, the other guy, old white guy, talked about, James Lovelock talked about last time, where, you would see systems sort of changing the atmosphere. And there's, I'll talk about this actually more next time in greater detail. But as I said, I do want to watch this video by him about using technology to bring back species that have gone extinct, which we are able to do now with a number of different species.
Now, extinction is a different kind of death. It's bigger. We didn't really realize that until 1914, when the last passenger pigeon, a female named Martha, died at the Cincinnati Zoo. This had been the most abundant bird in the world. It had been in North America for 6 million years, so it wasn't here at all. Flocks that were a mile wide and 400 miles long used to darken the sun. Aldo Leopold said this was a biological storm, feathered tempest. And indeed, it was a keystone species that enriched the entire eastern deciduous forest, from the Mississippi to the Atlantic, from Canada down to the Gulf. But it went from 5 billion birds to 0 in just a couple decades. What happened? Well, commercial hunting happened. These birds were hunted for meat that was sold by the ton. And it was easy to do because when those big flocks came down to the ground, they were so dense that hundreds of hunters and netters could show up and slaughter them by the tens of thousands. It was the cheapest source of protein in America. By the end of the century, there was nothing left but these beautiful skins in museum specimen drawers. There's an upside to the story. This made people realize that the same thing was about to happen to the American bison. And so these birds saved the buffaloes. But a lot of other animals weren't saved. The Carolina parakeet was a parrot that lit up backyards everywhere. It was hunted to death for its feathers. There's a bird that people liked on the East Coast called the heath hen. It was loved. They tried to protect it. It died anyway. A local newspaper spelled out, there's no survivor, there's no future, there's no life to be recreated in this form ever again. There's a sense of deep tragedy that goes with these things. And it happened to lots of birds that people loved. It happened to lots of mammals. Another keystone species is a famous animal called the European oryx. There's sort of a movie made about it recently. And the oryx was like the bison. This was an animal that basically kept the forest mixed with grasslands across the entire Europe and Asian continent, from Spain to Korea. The documentation on this animal goes back to the Lascaux cave paintings. The extinctions still go on. There's an ibex in Spain called a bucardo, went extinct in 2000. There was a marvelous animal, a marsupial wolf, called the thylacine, in Tasmania, south of Australia, called the Tasmanian tiger. It was hunted until there were just a few left to die in zoos. A little bit of film was shot. Sorrow, anger, mourning. Don't mourn, organize. What if you found out that using the DNA in museum specimens and fossils, maybe up to 200,000 years old, could be used to bring species back? What would you do? Where would you start? Well, you start by finding out if the biotech is really there. I started with my wife, Ryan Phelan, who ran a biotech business called DNA Direct. And through her, one of her colleagues, George Church, one of the leading genetic engineers, who turned out to be also obsessed with passenger pigeons, and a lot of confidence that methodologies he was working on might actually do the deed. So he and Ryan organized and hosted a meeting at the Wyss Institute in Harvard, bringing together specialists in passenger pigeons, conservation ornithologists, bioethicists. And fortunately, passenger pigeon DNA had already been sequenced by a molecular biologist named Beth Shapiro. All she needed from those specimens at the Smithsonian was a little bit of toe pad tissue. Is down in there is what is called ancient DNA. It's DNA which is pretty badly fragmented, but with good techniques now, you can basically reassemble the whole genome. Then the question is, can you reassemble with that genome the whole bird? George Church thinks you can. So in his book, Regenesis, which I recommend, he has a chapter, The Science of Bringing Back Extinct Species. And he has a machine called the Multiplex Automated Genome Engineering Machine. It's kind of like an evolution machine. You try combinations of genes that you write at the cell level and then in organs on a chip, and the ones that win that you can then put into a living organism, and it'll work. The precision of this, one of George's famous unreadable slides, nevertheless points out that there's a level of precision here right down to the individual base pair. Passenger pigeon has 1.3 billion base pairs in its genome. So what you're getting is the capability now of replacing one gene with another variation of that gene. It's called an allele. Well, that's what happens in normal hybridization anyway. So this is a form of synthetic hybridization of the genome of an extinct species with the genome of its closest living relative. Now, along the way, George points out that his technology, the technology of synthetic biology, is currently accelerating at 4 times the rate of Moore's law. It's been doing that since 2005, and it's likely to continue. Okay, the closest living relative of the passenger pigeon is the band-tailed pigeon. They're abundant, there's some around here. Genetically, the band-tailed pigeon already is mostly living passenger pigeon. There's just some bits that are band-tailed pigeon. If you replace those bits with passenger pigeon bits, you've got the extinct bird back cooing at you. Now, there's work to do. You have to figure out exactly what genes matter. So there's genes for the short tail in the band-tailed pigeon, genes for the long tail in the passenger pigeon, so on with the red eye, peach-colored breast, flocking, and so on. You add them all up, the result won't be perfect, but it should be perfect enough, because nature doesn't do perfect either. So this meeting in Boston led to 3 things. First off, Ryan and I decided to create a nonprofit called Revive and Restore that would push de-extinction generally and try to have it go in a responsible way. And we would push ahead with the passenger pigeon. Another direct result was a young grad student named Ben Novak, who'd been obsessed with passenger pigeons since he was 14 and had also learned how to work with ancient DNA, himself sequenced the passenger pigeon using money from his family and friends. We hired him full-time. Now, this photograph I took of him last year at the Smithsonian, he's looking down at Martha, the last passenger pigeon alive. So if he's successful, she won't be the last. The third result of the Boston meeting was the realization that there are scientists all over the world working on various forms of de-extinction, but they'd never met each other. And the National Geographic got interested because National Geographic has the theory that the last century discovery was basically finding things, and in this century, discovery is basically making things. De-extinction falls in that category. So they hosted and funded this meeting of 35 scientists. They were conservation biologists, molecular biologists, basically meeting to see if they had work to do together. Some of these conservation biologists are pretty radical. There's 3 of them who are not just recreating ancient species, they're recreating extinct ecosystems in northern Siberia, in the Netherlands, and in Hawaii. Henry, from the Netherlands, with a Dutch last name I won't try to pronounce, is working on the aurochs. The aurochs is the ancestor of all domestic cattle. And so basically its genome is alive, it's just unevenly distributed. So what they're doing is working with 7 breeds of primitive, hardy-looking cattle like that Marimana primitivo on the top there to rebuild over time with selective backbreeding the aurochs. Now, rewilding is moving faster in Korea than it is in America. And so the plan is with these rewilded areas all over Europe, they will introduce the aurochs to do its old job, its old ecological role of clearing the somewhat barren closed canopy forest so that it has these biodiverse meadows in it. Another amazing story came from Alberto Fernandez Arias. Alberto worked with a bucardo in Spain. The last bucardo was a female named Celia, who was still alive, but then they captured her. They got a little bit of tissue from her ear. They cryopreserved it in liquid nitrogen, released her back to the wild, but a few months later, she was found dead under a fallen tree. They took the DNA from that ear. They planted it as a cloned egg in a goat. The pregnancy came to term, and a live baby bucardo was born. It was the first de-extinction in history. It was short-lived. Sometimes interspecies clones have respiration problems. This one had a malformed lung and died after 10 minutes. But Alberto is confident that cloning has moved along well since then, and this will move ahead, and eventually there will be a population of bucardos back in the mountains in northern Spain. Cryopreservation pioneer of great depth is Oliver Ryder. At the San Diego Zoo, his frozen zoo has collected the tissues from over 1,000 species over the last 35 years. Now, when it's frozen that deep, minus 196 degrees Celsius, the cells are intact and the DNA is intact. They're basically viable cells. So someone like Bob Lanza at Advanced Cell Technology took some of that tissue from an endangered animal called the Javan banteng, put it in a cow, the cow went to term, and what was born was a live, healthy baby Javan banteng who thrived and is still alive. The most exciting thing for Bob Lanza is the ability now to take any kind of cell with induced pluripotent stem cells, turn it into germ cells like sperm and eggs. So now we go to Mike McGrew, who's a scientist at Rosalind Institute in Scotland, and Mike's doing miracles with birds. So he'll take, say, falcon skin cells, fibroblasts, turn it into induced pluripotent stem cells. Since it's so pluripotent, it can become germplasm. He then has a way to put the germplasm into the embryo of a chicken egg so that that chicken will have basically the gonads of a falcon. You get a male and a female, each of those, and out of them comes falcons. Real falcons out of slightly doctored chickens. Ben Novak was the youngest scientist at the meeting. He showed how all of this can be put together. The sequence of events. You'll put together the genomes of the band-tailed pigeon and the passenger pigeon. You'll take the techniques of George Church and get passenger pigeon DNA, the techniques of Robert Lanza and Michael McGrew, get that DNA into chicken gonads. Out of the chicken gonads, get passenger pigeon eggs and squabs, and now you're getting a population of passenger pigeons. It does raise the question of, they're not going to have passenger pigeon parents to teach them how to be a passenger pigeon. So what do you do about that? Well, birds are pretty hardwired as it happens, so most of that's already in their DNA. But to supplement it, part of Ben's idea is to use homing pigeons to help train the young passenger pigeons how to flock and how to find their way to their old nesting grounds and feeding grounds. There were some conservationists, really famous conservationists, like Stanley Temple, is one of the founders of conservation biology, and Kate Jones from the IUCN, which does the Red List. They're excited about all this. They're also concerned that it might be competitive with the extremely important efforts to protect endangered species that are still alive, that haven't gone extinct yet. And so you want to work on protecting the animals out there. You want to work on getting the market for ivory in Asia down so you're not losing 25,000 elephants a year. But at the same time, conservation biologists are realizing that bad news bums people out. And so the Red List is really important. Keep track of what's endangered and critically endangered and so on. But they're about to create what they call a green list. And the green list will have species that are doing fine, thank you. Species that were endangered, like the bald eagle, but they're much better off now, thanks to everybody's good work. And protected areas around the world that are very, very well managed. So basically, they're learning how to build on good news. And they see reviving extinct species is the kind of good news you might be able to build on. Here's a couple related examples. Captive breeding will be a major part of bringing back these species. The California condor was down to 22 birds in 1987. Everybody thought it was finished. Thanks to captive breeding at San Diego Zoo, there's 405 of them now. 226 are out in the wild. That technology will be used on de-extincted animals. Another success story is the mountain gorilla in Central Africa. In 1981, Diane Fossey was sure they were going extinct. There were just 254 left. Now there are 880. They're increasing in population by 3% a year. The secret is they have a ecotourism program, which is absolutely brilliant. So this photograph was taken last month by Ryan with an iPhone. That's how comfortable these wild gorillas are with visitors. Another interesting project that's going to need some help is the northern white rhinoceros. There's no breeding pairs left. But this is the kind of thing that a wide variety of DNA for this animal is available in the frozen zoo. A bit of cloning, you can get them back. So where do we go from here? These have been private meetings so far. I think it's time for the subject to go public. What do people think about it? You know, do you want extinct species back? Do you want extinct species back? Tinkerbell is going to come fluttering then. It is a Tinkerbell moment because, you know, what are people excited about with this? What are they concerned about? We're also going to push ahead with the passenger pigeon. So Ben Novak, even as we speak, is joining the group that Beth Shapiro has at UC Santa Cruz. They're going to work on the genomes of the passenger pigeon and the band-tailed pigeon. As that data matures, they'll send it to George Church, who will work his magic, get passenger pigeon DNA out of that. We'll get help from Bob Lanza and Mike McGrew to get that into germplasm that can go into chickens, that can produce passenger pigeon squabs, that can be raised by band-tailed pigeon parents, and from then on, as passenger pigeons all the way, maybe for the next 6 million years. You can do the same thing as the costs come down for the Carolina parakeet, for the great auk, for the heath hen, for the ivory-billed woodpecker, for the Eskimo curlew, for the Caribbean monk seal, for the woolly mammoth. Because the fact is, humans have made a huge hole in nature in the last 10,000 years. We have the ability now, and maybe the moral obligation, to repair some of the damage. Most of that we'll do by expanding and protecting wildlands, by expanding and protecting the populations of endangered species. But some species that we killed off totally, we could consider bringing back to a world that misses them. Thank you.
Right, everyone. So that is De-Extinction. That's Stuart Brand, interesting and controversial guy. As you can see, as you can probably imagine, there's numerous controversies around de-extinction, or sometimes it's called resurrection ecology, although that sounds a little bit too theological or something. So as you saw, there have been successes, and that video is a few years old, so there's groups have moved forward on it. But again, there are big regulatory, moral questions regarding the use of de-extinction. Do we bring back all species just because we can? Do we bring back some that have gone extinct in the last 20 to 50 years, where their habitat maybe hasn't changed a lot? If we bring, if the Australia's habitat sort of regrows and recovers from the fire, we could bring back more koalas, and they would not be heading toward extinction at this point. So again, but there's possibility for misuse as well, as a movie called Jurassic Park pointed out. Just to be clear, we don't actually have any dinosaur DNA. We can't actually sequence any genomes from dinosaurs, so that's not a real concern, at least not at this point. But there are concerns about maybe other animals, reintroducing them. How would we do this? What if they migrate across national borders? This sort of thing. So the questions are not, and as we'll see when we talk about science and technology next week, we are making incredible leaps and bounds in our scientific knowledge, in our technological advancement, and so on. But as we'll see, the real question about a lot of science and technology is not so much what we can do and what we're able to do, but what we should do. And that comes down to a more, that goes back to, some of these basic moral philosophies and things we've been discussing in this class. So anyway, I think, we've got enough to discuss for today on environmental sociology. On Friday, I will talk about disproportionality and environmental justice, go into sort of the imbalances in environmental pollution and so on that sometimes aren't focused on quite as much. All right, have a good day, everyone.